We are live. We are live and ready to go. We have Alexander McCurris in London, the Oracle of London, and we are joined once again with the one and only, the great man himself, Mr. Robert Barnes. Robert, how are you doing?
Well, at the off-the-record bar at the cellar of the Hotel Palmer outside of D.C., when they heard about the recent new checks being issued to Ukraine, you could hear chants of Slava slush funds as the money continues to churn and churn and churn, while other activities were going on in some other locations.
Oh, yes, they were. Yes, they were. Where can people find you, Robert, real quick?
Yeah, they can get all of the content, including exclusive content, hush-hush videos. I have one up on alternative theories of history and conspiracies on MK Ultra currently. Got one coming up on Bill Barr coming up this weekend about his interesting family history, as well as some other ties and connections at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Link is in the description box down below. At the end of the live stream, I will make that into a pinned comment as well. The best channel on locals. Definitely plug into their locals channel. It is fantastic, and you get a whole ton of content. So let's get right into it, everybody, because we have got so much to talk about, and we've got a lot of detective work to get into. But first, let's say hello to everybody that is watching us on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and on the Duran.locals.com. Hello to the chat on the Duran.locals.com. Hello to everyone that is watching us on Telegram as well. And a quick hello to our amazing, awesome moderators. Allison Blunderland is with us. Reckless Abandon is with us. Valies, it is good to have you with us. And I think I saw Zariel hiding somewhere in the chat. Zariel, how are you doing? And I think I've got everybody. Facts Matter. Facts Matter is also moderating. Good to have you here. And let's jump into it. Alexander, Robert, I'm going to pass it off to you. Before I forget, though, Alexander and Robert, Reckless Abandon wanted me to ask you guys, when you start discussing everything, if you can touch upon the hit lists in the United States, the Ukraine hit lists in the United States, and what are the legal implications of those lists? Like, what's going on there? I just don't want to forget that. So I throw it over to you, Alexander, and to the great Robert Barnes. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
That's a very good question, actually. But before we get to that, I just can't help but make the point that, we're going to talk about lots of things, but one of the things that pulls everything together is follow the money, it seems to me. And just to say, Robert, you started about the latest checks for Ukraine, and we saw $1 billion, provision of weapons for Ukraine announced yesterday. And I said to myself, this is really impressive. They're going to provide Ukraine with another $1 billion of weapons, 18 HIMARS systems, except it turns out they're not, because they're not actually going to provide Ukraine with 18 HIMARS systems. They're going to order the Raytheon or whoever makes these things to actually make these systems, and they might be provided to Ukraine in 1 or 2 years' time. Now, I wonder whether there's going to be a Ukraine in 1 or 2 years' time. But I mean, follow the money. The money is flowing. The money is flowing into the MIC. The money is going to flow into parts of the gas and energy industry as well. I'm sure some of that money is finding its way into Washington, to all sorts of interesting places, and other places too. And well, maybe it's not so completely unrelated to the fact that there are lists of people who are, raising issues. What do you think of the list, Robert, before we get onto the money? I mean, what would be the implications of a list like that in the United States? In Britain, it was published here. It would be a very serious matter. At least the police would certainly take action, and they would be talking to whoever published that list, and there'd be criminal charges of that. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever. But it's Ukraine. Nothing happens. Nobody says anything. Nobody talks about anything. What do you think?
I mean, it's deeply problematic. I mean, Senator Rand Paul is on that list. For those that don't know, it's, some called it a blacklist. Others have called it a hit list, put out as supposedly people that are pro-Russian. But if you look at what the language and lingo utilized, and of course, Dugin's daughter was on that list, and she was assassinated by what appears to be a Ukrainian covert operative, is that this is more of a hit list. These are basically people being called Russian spies. Engaged in sabotage effectively, seditious behavior, the kind that was used during World War I to lock up people like Eugene Debs, socialist presidential candidate for the White House after he had one of his most successful campaigns in 1912. And so you look at that, it's problematic. I mean, it depends on how the list would be interpreted. I mean, it has been distributed here, published in a certain sense. America's First Amendment laws are limited to imminent incitement of violence. So, in other words, it can't just be incitement of violence. It has to have imminent risk of the violence actually occurring, what's sometimes called true threats. Now, all that law is being eviscerated in the context of Alex Jones, who's going through another show trial in Connecticut after the show trial in Texas. But putting the Alex Jones exception to every rule that exists on the planet, to give examples, famous case Brandenburg v. Ohio, Klan rally where they called for violence against the local black population. Supreme Court said no legal action could be taken against them because it wasn't imminent risk of a true threat. Famously, at a Vietnam protest in the 1960s, there are special federal laws protecting the president of the United States from assassination threats. A guy got up and talked about his gun and who he was putting in his sights, whereas Lyndon Baines Johnson. U.S. Supreme Court said that, too, was not a true threat because it didn't have an imminent risk of the event occurring. And so that list would be legal in the United States at this point because they would likely conclude it's not an imminent risk of violence, even though it's deeply problematic that such lists are being distributed. And it's kind of interesting how those lists tend not to reflect necessarily Ukrainian adversaries as deep state adversaries. I mean, you have Glenn Greenwald on that list. You have, Rand Paul on that list. These are people that haven't been that big of a needle on the issue of Ukraine specifically. They've been critics of U.S. policy, but nothing real strong. They have, however, been two of the strongest deep state critics. And it makes you wonder who the original author of that list was. At least it's probably a little bit more subtle. They at least have some sort of patsy compared to the utter debacle and disaster of what they did in terms of probably the biggest terroristic act in the modern era, at least against civilian infrastructure, by a state as opposed to private actors. And it's very apparent the U.S. blew up the pipeline. I mean, within hours of it occurring, I had friends of mine who used to be in a particular branch of the military that would actually execute that precise task, who explained to me that U.S. definitely did it. And he knew likely who was part of it because he helped train some of those people. And then he pointed me to sources. And then to others, stories and articles said, here's where you can find the trail. And of course, where it took place is where just a few months ago, we were doing, special practices of learning how to use things to test the underground. Purportedly, it was to monitor for underground undersea mines using underwater drone technology. But it's extraordinary that in the same place that they detected this pipeline explosion is exactly where the U.S. military was around the time of the event. The same tactical units, Navy SEAL connected units that were present. And it was the same one just a few months before, supposedly running exercises to test how certain equipment would work with underground explosions, supposedly about mines, in exactly the same area. So, and then you had Biden, who's such a dementia candidate idiot. He was asked when he made that comment about, we'll stop Nord Stream no matter what if Russia invades Ukraine. Somebody followed up and said, how? This is a German-Russian deal. And, Biden can't help himself. He smirked in the reaction to it. It was like, there's something. And, of course, Victoria Nuland has been predicting this for a while. And I think for people wondering, why did the ex-foreign minister of Poland thank the U.S. with his thing? given he's tied to neoliberal establishment people by marriage here in the United States and by family and other relationships. It's because there are large parts of the deep state apparatus here in the States that would like to take credit for this. They think what they did was great. They think what they did is prove the power of America to dictate its agenda around the globe. They want to take credit for it. They're like Jack Nicholson's character in A Few Good Men. He wants to say, "You're damn right. I ordered that. Well, I ordered that bread." So it's the same mindset. It's the reason why they yapped about the election fornication, right? I mean, I forget it was a time, or I think it was time. They couldn't help themselves. They had to say, "Yeah, we stole it, and we did it for you, the American people. We did it for democracy and all the rest," because they're proud of what they did. And it's a mindset, and it's a mindset that bleeds over into our other topics of conversation today, because it's about complete lack of respect for boundaries, any boundaries. I mean, here you have the United States government involved in one of the major state, not just state-sponsored, state-directed, did it, terrorist activities on civilian infrastructure against primarily a principal ally. I mean, how much it hurts Russia is up in the air, given how much Russia really thought they were ever going to use either Nord Stream 1 or 2 in the future. It stripped them of leverage vis-a-vis Germany, but mostly it screwed Germany. I mean, it kept Germany from having a bailout package down the road of any for their own economy and their own industry, which the U.S. had been a long critic of. I mean, the Trump administration was critical of it. Rick Grenell was critical of it. Everybody on the U.S. side hated the deal that Schroeder cut with Putin all the way back, that Merkel continued to promote German industry with cheap Russian gas. As the Credit Suisse financial advisor said, it was one of the greatest deals of all time for Germany in the sense of, and their industry depends upon it. I mean, how they're going to replace it. But if I were looking for conspiracy theories, I would look to see whether anybody was shorting certain German stocks and putting some money maybe in American LNG stocks that a little bit before these events happen. They always got to cash in, the way the deep state kind of operates. But I have zero doubt the U.S. deliberately, intentionally blew up the pipelines as a way to strip Russia of any leverage and prevent Schultz from bailing out his own country and his own problems, self-created problems, by doing it. It is extraordinary to see the EU today playing Russia. I mean, it's like you know, first you were blowing up your own nuclear facilities, and then you were shelling yourself all the time and shelling your own children in the Donbass. And now you blew up your own pipeline and your strongest piece of leverage with Germany. I mean, the degree of insanity they're asking people to believe, it's like pandemic level propaganda. But I have no doubt the U.S. committed one of the most, and it's extraordinary how low coverage there is in the U.S. This is one of the most extraordinary terroristic events against civilian infrastructure, against primarily an ally, Germany, in the history of the world since World War II. I mean, I don't know of many state-sponsored, state-directed, state-enacted terroristic events like this, and we really didn't hide it that much. I mean, it's kind of a little bit terrifying, but it's reflective of the whole Biden administration. Boundaries are gone, limits are gone, restraints are gone. This is the most dangerous administration in American political history.
I completely agree.
With A Few Good Men, by the way.
It is, yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Go ahead. Sorry, I had to get that in there because I was.
You did. You're absolutely right, Alex. Right. Can I just say? I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the most dangerous administration I have ever known. Program about this yesterday, in which I expressed the identical view to the one that you just have, and somebody then forwarded to me a Guardian article from about 2004 or something, in which that article drew my attention to a book published by some American intelligence person about how the US engineered the explosion in a Russian pipeline way back in 1982. And this was done during the Reagan administration. And what they did was, it was a gas pipeline. It was sending gas to Europe. The Reagan administration wasn't happy about it. So the CIA arranged for some software to be incorporated in the pipeline. And then the software was sent to Siberia, Western Siberia. And then after a few months, it caused an explosion. Apparently, it was an enormous explosion. It could be seen in space. There is a fundamental difference and that was an attack on the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure of your Cold War adversary. This is an attack, if it was done by the United States, on the energy infrastructure of your most important European ally. Now, I just cannot comprehend how a responsible government could do a thing like that. I mean, it is something which, if you'd asked me 10, 25 years ago, I would have said impossible. And here we are. And it looks like I'm convinced, just as Robert is, I'm convinced it's happened. And when this sort of thing happens, it's really rather scary, because you know that you are dealing with someone, an administration that has no boundaries. And what have we been talking about in program after program with Robert since we started this series? It's about extraordinary abuses and contraventions of the Constitution and legal system of the United States, carried out by the administration, carried out by the agencies of the administration. And they do this time and time and time again. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. And it's becoming ever more dangerous. Now, Robert, you said that this is going to be a disaster for Germany. I was reading the Financial Times this morning, as I always do. And lo and behold, there was an article based on the work of some German think tanks, and they put it all together, and they say that because of the loss of cheap Russian gas, Germany could be looking at an 8% contraction next year. An 8% contraction in 2023.
In other words, bigger than Russia's contraction is likely going to end up being.
Well,
They've sanctioned themselves. You know, I was initially a skeptic of people saying that the U.S. wants to sink the German economy.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know why would we want that? I mean, I get that maybe we could get in some competitive edge, but it's not like, I mean, mostly that would potentially go to China's competitive edge in terms of certain areas of industrial development, manufacturing, output, et cetera. But, you know, this is really overt. In other words, they know that the consequences of this is not only removing a political tool, but would do severe damage to the Germany industry moving forward. And I don't know how much Germans recognize or how much they were, you know, don't connect cheap gas to the economic competitive edge they've had in the last 2 decades within continental Europe. They've maintained their industrial production output, whereas large parts of elsewhere in the Western world did not. And I don't know how they sustain that without natural gas, without cheap Russian gas. I mean, like the idea that American LNG is much more expensive, and that's going to take a lot more time to produce. I mean, it will line some pockets of some American companies, but it can't substitute from a cost-effective perspective in Germany. But what's extraordinary is like some people say that criminals have low IQ, and I always like to point out, aside from I have issues with IQ testing, but putting that aside, I was like, it's only caught criminals who have low IQ, because those are the only people you're testing. You're not testing the uncaught criminals. So, and what you find in common is they are only one-step thinkers. They're not two-step thinkers. So they think, oh man, I like to grab that purse. They don't think, how do I get away with it? Second step's not there. And that's how they get caught. That's why caught criminals have low IQ. But the Biden administration is a similar low IQ caught criminal kind of administration. It's like they have one step ahead. We'll take out the ability for Russia to have any leverage over Germany, or for Germany to wuss out at the end in terms of supporting the Ukrainian conflict and war by permanently ending. I mean, I have no doubt that these plans have been decades in the making, that they had made the plans to take out how they would take out the pipelines way back. The hostility had been there from the inception. Amanda Milius, my friend, daughter of John Milius, the great movie director, she herself documentary director of The Plot Against the President, making a new documentary on John McAfee, doing a bunch of other great documentary projects. She worked in the State Department under Trump and talked about all the insanity there. The State Department was dominated by a combination, more neoliberals than neocons, depending on your perspective. That's really only a slight variation. It's like the difference of opinion about Iran, say, or Saudi Arabia. But same imperialist, globalist mindset, empire builders. But not only their self-righteousness was off the charts, but they were more obsessed. The number one issue she said they were obsessed with was Nord Stream 2. It's like, of all the things in the world to be obsessed with, they were obsessed with Nord Stream 2. That's why they're always putting pressure on Grinnell to stir things up. Now, he stirred him up in such an undiplomatic way that he actually undermined American interest in Germany, because that's Grinnell. People like Grinnell because he did some good work at the Office of Director of National Intelligence about Russiagate, Spygate. Grinnell was the guy who worked with Pence to make sure Julian Assange got seized and stolen and put in prison. I have no sympathy with him. Only reason he didn't get to join the Romney campaign team is because Romney refused to have any gay people on his team, of publicly gay people. I mean, that's just Romney being Romney. Pick some women instead. That's classic. But he was never, he did limited good work, and it's emphasized the word limited. His alliance with Trump was one of convenience, not of shared ideological approach. But they were just obsessed with this parochially. And I was like, what are they? Because they were talking DC about this possibility all the way back then. Well, we could always just take them out. We could just take out the pipelines. They're just not. They're not invulnerable from sabotage, and we're probably better at this than almost anybody. I mean, we tried to do it with the Soviet cables back in the day. All this. I mean, our big advantage over China is in the submarine area. It's one area where our military is still technically quite competent, even if wokeism is corroding the military otherwise, despite some liberal media people saying the Ukrainian army is proof that wokeism is the future of the military success. But I couldn't understand. It's like, what do you think? Obviously, they knew that probably Der Spiegel's accidental leak almost of the CIA tipping off the Germans is that they already ran this by the Germans and they didn't get major pushback, apparently. Because they're not tipping them off. The Russians are going to do it because the Germans would know that's not going to happen. I mean, there's other ways for the Russians to do this than cut off their own leverage. That's not going to happen. And as the Russians pointed out today, the area where the explosion took place was under control of U.S. Military and intelligence at the time it occurred. But they were expecting no blowback at all from Germany. No blowback from anybody in Europe. I mean, the rest of the world's going to know what this is. And Europe's going to know really who's responsible, despite what they're preaching or teaching. And it's like, what kind of mindset is we're going to engage in massive civilian terroristic infrastructure that mostly impairs an ally, and nobody's going to get upset about it. Instead, they'll actually use it to blame Russia more and put more sanctions on them. I mean, it just shows, I guess, the degree of corrosive corruption in European governing regimes. But but otherwise, also, maybe they just don't have a second step. It's like Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. It's like, well, what's step 2 if China reacts a particular way? What's step 2 if Germany or Europe or the global South reacts a certain way to this terrorist attack on Russia? Instead, we get the Telegraph today talking about maybe tactical nuclear warfare might be okay. Here's how it could work out all right. These people are insane. There's no other way to put it. And they're low IQ. Yeah, if you want your criminals to at least be Lex Luthor. They're insane, at least be intelligent. Now we got dumb nuts running the show.
Absolutely. What's particularly frightening is we have, as you said, idiots running the show. But they're idiots who do have the power to command still what remains, in many ways, in most ways, the most technologically advanced military in the world. I completely agree. If you want to get someone to do something under the ocean better than anyone else, it's the US. The US has the best people at this. Ask anybody who knows about these things, and I've asked around, they all say the same. The Americans have the best submarine fleet, the biggest submarine fleet. They got the, they're the people who have the midget submarines, who understand this thing backwards. And well, there you go. Just a few other things on this, Robert. You said the rest of the world knows. I was reading another newspaper I sometimes read, as well as the Financial Times, is Global Times, which is, as we know, the English language mouthpiece of the Communist Party of China. Anyway, they did an editorial about this, and it was a very fascinating editorial, because it doesn't actually say it's the US that did this, but they set up the whole thing basically to say, look, we know it was the US that did this. I mean, you only have to read it. The clues all point that they set out all point very obviously in one direction. And everybody around the world is going to think that. They're all going to think that it was the US that did this. Now, a number of other things. Firstly, why would the United States get so worked up about a couple of gas pipelines? I don't understand that, actually. I mean, anybody who knows Germany well, which I do, I mean, I know it reasonably well, would tell you that this is one of the most loyal states in the Western Alliance. I mean, German political leaders simply cannot imagine any kind of political alignment for Germany which is not led by the United States. There's a few people on the margins, the AfD, a few people on the AfD, a few people, on Die Linke, which is in the process of slow motion collapse, by the way, who, sometimes quibble about these things. But if you know German politicians, I mean, they are Atlanticists to the core. It just is inconceivable to them that they could be anything else. There's German industry, which obviously wants to trade and sell and do business with Russia and China and everywhere you like. But if you're talking about an alliance, a loyalty to an alliance, worrying about Nord Stream 2 somehow undermining that alliance, if you know your Germany, that is ridiculous. That is absurd. That is completely ludicrous. And yet it seems people in Washington were fixated with this. And you're absolutely right what you said about the importance of natural gas in giving Germany an economic edge. Gerhard Schroeder, who was a very clever man, he did two things for Germany. The first is he carried out very, very controversial labor reforms, which basically weakened the position of German unions and made German wage systems much more competitive. That was, by the way, one of the effects of that is that it undermined forever working class support for the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And that's why they've never really managed to hit the 40% votes that they did in the past when they were led by people like Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt. But anyway, that did make those reforms Schroeder made. They did make Germany more competitive. The other thing which went with it was that he negotiated all these gas deals. He set up Nord Stream 1. He looked forward. He inked the idea of Nord Stream 2. Then along came Angela Merkel, and she dithered about this. She wasn't particularly sure whether she wanted to go ahead with Nord Stream 2. And then she said, well, actually, I do need Nord Stream 2 because I'm now in bed with the Greens. I've got the Greens as my allies. They don't like nuclear power very much. We've had this accident in Japan, in Fukushima. There's been this huge backlash against nuclear power in Germany. So what we're going to do is we're going to close all our nuclear power plants, and we need cheap energy. So let's revive Nord Stream 2. And in 2015, after the crisis in Ukraine had already begun, and after Putin had already been sanctioned, or at least Russia had already been sanctioned by Germany, amongst other countries, Merkel went to Moscow, she had met with Putin, and she talked him into the idea of restarting Nord Stream 2. And by that point, Gazprom, the Russians, were very uncertain because they were saying, look, if we go ahead with Nord Stream 2, you're going to sanction it. You're going to block it at some point, because the whole trend now is to go for sanctions. And Merkel gave them a cast iron guarantee that would never happen. There would never be sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Whatever sanctions there were, they wouldn't cover Nord Stream 2, and Nord Stream 2 wouldn't be covered by the EU's third energy package. And very, very reluctantly, against their better judgment, the Russians went along with it. It was the Germans that wanted it. The Germans wanted it in order to preserve the competitiveness of their industries. And now that is gone, and it's gone forever. And there's talk about an 8% contraction. Just for the record, the Russian central bank is predicting that the economic contraction in Russia this year will be around 4%. The economics ministry in Russia is saying it'll be around 2%. There's a revised consensual agreement that it will be 2.9%. In other words, 3%. They've basically cut the difference. And there'll be growth next year. Russian economy is going to go back into growth next year, basically irrespective of what happens to sanctions. So we're going to see Germany implode and Russia grow.
What's extraordinary is, who knew we would be sitting here today saying, by golly, we would miss Angela Merkel. I mean, the reality is this never happens if Merkel is there. The war in Ukraine doesn't likely happen. The sanctions war doesn't likely happen. There's no way the U.S. blows up the pipelines while she's there. I did not realize the degree to which she was a restraint, given her EU proclivities and other propensities, on this sort of globalist agenda, this deep state, national security state, whatever you want to call it, agenda in Ukraine. And they're just unleashing everything. And it reminds me of the 1950s, early 1960s American deep state power apparatus in probable collusion with the UK here. We'll see. I mean, the UK, as you noted, Alexander, does have this, imagines itself, fancies itself as still the James Bond of MI6, that kind of, sabotage and secrecy and subversion and the things that they're, in their minds. I always think of Our Man in Havana, even before Taylor of Panama, as to what a lot of this really looks like in reality. And we saw it, of course, with ex-MI6 Christopher Steele, who is the principal propagandist and propagator of the Russiagate hoax. Not a coincidence, all tied into Ukraine and other things too. People forget that was where he was getting his payroll from. But I guess it's clear how the Europeans are going to react, that they're just going to go along and play along and pretend this didn't happen, like a lot of other things. It reminds, like when people said, how in the world could the U.S. really have sabotage of continental Europe? I'd go back and recommend, well, not only our intervention in elections in France and Italy and Greece and some other places in the post-World War II era, and who we went into business with there, certain good family men in places like parts of France and places in Corsica and in, of course, Sicily and Italy, as an alignment to beat the commies, and whatnot. But Operation Gladio, I have a little whole hush-hush episode on Operation Gladio, but, that left behind units often were ex-Nazis and fascists, of course, but ended up causing problems in places like Italy and elsewhere, because when you leave behind a group that has a very distinct ideology, a propensity to violence, and you help train and arm them in secret, that tends to go in directions you may not want it to go in. And so the idea of sabotage of Europe for the broader globalist agenda, deep state agenda, is very much within their wheelhouse. But the scariest thing is all the points that the people in the chat are mentioning in the super chats, is that none of this seems to have second level thinking. How will Germany react? How will Europe react? How will Russia react? How will the global South react? How will the American populace react if they ever find this out? I think the only chance of that is if there's a Republican sweep and enough of the right people get into positions of power. Not clear that's going to happen as yet for this Biden administration. But it is, to engage in just open, overt terror against an ally is terrifying. I see how Germany's going to react. They're just going to, capitulate, go home, and pretend the Ruskies blew up their own pipeline. But how? I mean, it removes the ability for Germany to have an easy exit now. The leverage that Russia had that is now gone over easy access to energy. The access that Germany could turn the spigots back on as a means of solving their own domestic issues is now gone. What's interesting is at least the American reaction is not. It's part of a piece of blaming the Russians, confession through projection. Everything they said about Trump has turned out to be true of the Biden administration, all the way down to having, they accused Trump's family members of being corrupt, particularly Don Jr. Well, of course, that's Hunter Biden, including involving Ukraine. Getting us on the risk of reckless policies is the Biden administration, not Trump. Getting us potentially involved in nuclear war, Biden administration, not Trump. Lack of second level thinking, second step thinking is Biden administration, not Trump. But to give people a sense of the scale of it, in the past week, like people had wondered what's going to be the U.S. reaction and the West reaction to amongst the deep state and the propagandists of this war, the military-industrial complex, the national security apparatus, the Atlanticists, the neoliberals and neocons who are aligned on the issue of Ukraine and Russia. Well, it's denial and delusion is what it is. And so to the Russian mobilization, to the Russian referendums, it's to pretend the referendums didn't exist and don't count. Yeah, I mean, it probably wasn't a coincidence that Putin scheduled this in this same last week of September that we scheduled the Kosovo independent vote many decades ago. It was also last week of September. Probably not a coincidence knowing Putin's modus operandi. The vote was overwhelming. Kherson, about 30% didn't vote. You can probably guess that 30% would have been mostly no votes. But that ship has sailed either way. They have the pretext they need to sweep in and take it over. And then it's Russian proper. And then any attacks on it is an attack on Russia from Russia's legal perspective. And we can't complain about it because we put all this into motion in the post-Cold War, post-Soviet, in the Soviet collapse and breakup era, and we really go all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, the idea of the self-empowerment, self-identification, self-authorization through independence movements and referendums. He was a huge fan of that. And the sort of and that nationalism probably didn't work out so well in certain parts of the world after that, but we used it as including Germany primarily when Yugoslavia broke up to rush in and recognize the breakaway republics, including the most egregious example from a legal perspective being Kosovo. But the International Court said that was fine and was not a problem, that there was no. So, I mean, Putin's obviously using all of those precedents that we perilously set now against us. And like when people say, well, isn't it illegal what Russia is doing? It's like, actually, it's legal by our own definition, our own terms, and our own precedents. So we would have to condemn and indict ourselves if we're now going to selectively indict Russia over what took place. But I do wonder what they think Russia's reaction is going to be. I mean, aside from the fact, I don't really think they think about second step at all. They just think, oh, we're going to take this out. We're going to show they love to show their power. It's why they secretly want to brag about it. That's why you see people like the ex-Polish guy saying, thank you, USA, after it happens. There's a part of the deep state that wants credit. Say, see how much power we have, see how smart we are, see how savvy we are. But also it's delusional thought. Like the reaction to the referendums didn't happen, don't matter, shams. The reaction to partial mobilization, it's a total disaster in Russia, according to the Western press. Everybody's fleeing the country. They're either trying to flee to Kazakhstan or flee across the border to Finland, or they're bordering so many planes, they're having to shut down the planes, that there's, people shooting each other at draft stops, that, it's in the New York Times writes a piece saying Russia acknowledges this when what they're talking about is something very different that Russia's talking about than what the West is preaching. So much so that you have people like John Brennan and others saying, once again, we're back to the Putin about to collapse, Russia regime about to fail narrative out of the West. And a good number of these people, at least in the Substack, social media, think tank publication world, appear to really believe this. So not only they can convince themselves that they can convince the world that they weren't responsible for the pipeline sabotage, but also that the referendums can be completely ignored and the legal constitutional consequence. What's amazing, doesn't come up in the West. They never mention Yugoslavia. They never mention Kosovo. They never mention the precedents that we helped establish for what Putin is now doing. They don't even mention the comparison. So it's just denial and delusion. And on the military front, all they talk about is the battles up in the northern part of the contested area. They don't focus on Bakhmut or the failed counteroffensive in Kherson. They talk about what took place in part of the Kharkiv and where they're trying to encircle certain towns in the northern part of the Luhansk province. And so they think that the mobilization doesn't matter and it's going to backfire. They think, and it already is, and it's just days. And on the economy side, I think Fortune today is back with what Yale put out a couple of months ago. The Russian economy just about to collapse once again. So we're back to all of those just repeated lies over and over and over and over. I have people on my own board that will repeat this to me. I'm like, well, what's your source? Oh, it's the Kiev Independent. It's like, the goes to Kiev Independent? That Kiev Independent? And it's like, yeah. I mean, they found a picture that goes to Kiev. It says Zelensky, and a broken down little a playground plane. I mean, that's a goes to Kiev. But it's just one after the other. My fear is that this isn't just propaganda, but that in key parts of the Pentagon, even though people like Colonel McGregor has pointed out, none of this is going to change the battlefield. Russia's going to win. It's only a matter of time. The only question is whether Russia adds Kharkiv and Odessa and any other regions to the equation, using just repeating, the pattern they did here: take it over, occupy it, hold a referendum a couple of months later, call it part of Russia, and destroy it. And I think that was politically savvy on Russia's part, because no one was ever going to recognize these regions as independent countries of their own type. So you might as well just incorporate it, move on down the road. But the Western press's reaction is denial and delusion. And my greatest fear is they actually believe it, because if you believe your own lies, that's when real trouble happens.
That's absolutely correct. A number of things about referendums. Well, I can remember that all these breakaway republics were holding them in the Soviet Union in its dying days, and we were cheering it along. We were saying this is a great fact that these referendums were happening. And in fact, as I recall, that is to say, most of the Western countries actually recognized the independence of these republics before the Soviet Union itself had formally given up the ghost. So, don't look at what we do, look at what we say, and that may change from one day to the next as it suits us. But you're absolutely right. We've set these disastrous precedents. We contradicted ourselves completely because, of course, as an American, that the United States, one of its presidents, Abraham Lincoln, he set his face against secession. I mean, wasn't he all about, once union has been created, it shouldn't be broken up? And didn't he make great speeches about this? But of course, that's not the policy that we export around the world. And when somebody like Putin comes along and does exactly what we have done in the past, well, that must mean that he's an aggressor, that he's a maniac, a demon, all the bad things that we inevitably and invariably called him. But I just wanted, just before we talk about that a bit more, I wanted to say something, because you're talking about the fact that these people don't understand second order consequences. And I think that's absolutely correct. Now, my memory extends back to the 1960s. And if you lived in Greece in the 1960s, believe me, the US was everywhere. I mean, the US essentially ran Greece, or lots of Greece, in the 1960s. There was even a time when in the apartment building where we lived, the family next door were CIA people from the embassy. So, they were everywhere. But two things. Firstly, they were intelligent people. And secondly, there was never any doubt at all that the politicians in Washington were in control and knew what they were doing. And we're talking about people like, JFK, LBJ, whatever you may think of him. They were people who had an understanding of things. And if you go back a little further, American policy in Europe in the 1950s and 1940s was to build Europe up. It was the United States that made it possible for Germany to recover and to rebuild. It was the United States in Little Greece, which I remember, that set the scene for a growth rate that we were having in the 50s and 60s, which was 7% per annum. The US in those days wasn't looking to immiserate its allies. It was looking to strengthen its allies, to make them prosperous, to make them rich, to build up an economic system, which, by the way, was not a globalist system in those days. It was very much still a system where trade was controlled to a great extent, much more so than today. It was the Bretton Woods system with fixed exchange rates, all connected to the dollar. So it's very different from today. But the point was that the United States wanted to integrate all of these countries into a system of world trade, which would be mutually beneficial for them and for the United States itself, because there was a very clear understanding that if the United States was going to maintain this extraordinary level of prosperity that it had achieved by the 1950s and the 1960s, it would need strong economies, friendly economies to trade with, and that in the 1950s and 60s meant the economies of countries like Europe and, of course, Japan and South Korea and other places. So what we see today, if there really are actually out there, blowing up pipelines in order to create problems for their European allies, that the wheel has come completely full circle. We're now in a policy where before, whatever deep state you had in those days, where before you had a policy of economic building and construction, a positive policy that won over people like me, made people like me very favorably disposed to the United States. What you now have, it seems to me, is a policy of nihilism, and sooner or later people will understand it, and it will make people in the future resent the United States. So, I mean, I cannot understand how the leadership class in America could have fallen into this folly. I mean, they're now so twisted and so caught up in their plots and schemes and plans and conspiracies and whatever that they've completely lost track of where US interests actually lie. I wanted to make that point as somebody, as I said, who remembers. It's just on the tip of my memory because I was a child, but everybody was talking about it. I mean, wherever you went, you saw Americans. Everybody talked about the Americans and what the Americans were doing, and the mood, the sentiment was overwhelmingly positive. Now, on the situation with the war, you're absolutely right, Robert. People are completely delusional about this. Of course, it's probably true that they're all getting their information from a very, very limited resource base. Now, every day I and Alex, we plow through all of these reports. There's very good reporters on the front lines. And of course, the thing to say about this is that in reality, this September, what has happened this September in this war has not been Ukraine winning. It is Ukraine still losing. September was the point where their military had swollen to its biggest ever possible size. They got all the weapons that the United States and the Europeans could throw at them. This was their moment. If they were ever going to succeed in turning this thing round, this September was going to be the month when they were going to do it. And they failed. They weren't able to break through in Kherson region. They weren't able to break through in the major places in Donbass. The place where they broke through, where in Kharkiv region, was a region which, for all kinds of reasons, the Russians had already largely pulled out from. So now they're trying to make attacks in northern Donbass. And the fact is that even though the Russians are actually outnumbered in these areas, they're finding it very difficult to make any progress at all. Now, in a few weeks, we're going to get the autumn rains. Offensives are going to come to a stop. They've lost large numbers of men over the course of the fighting over the last few weeks. Ukraine has. more importantly, they've lost lots of the machinery, the weapons, the tanks, all those things that the West has given them, and there's no replacements. And then when the ground hardens and the temperatures fall and the tanks can start moving again, they're going to be faced with a Russian military on a far bigger scale than what they've been up against until this moment. So, in fact, this has not been a good month for Ukraine, at least not in my perception. It's been a month of failure, of actual overall military failure. Now, on the point about the fact that it's easier for the Russians just to incorporate regions into Russia than to try and pretend that they're independent, that is obviously right. And again, if you look at the publications of their allies or their friends, let's call them friends rather than allies, China, India, and all the rest, it's much easier for the Chinese and the Indians to continue to support Russia if it's incorporating these territories than to support Russia if Russia is supporting secessionists. Because Chinese, Indians do not like secession, but they're very nationalistic and they understand very well that if you're bringing people into the motherland again and you're protecting your own people, that's something that the Chinese and the Indians can do. These referendums are going to simplify, are going to make Russian diplomatic moves from now on easier than they had been previously. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, all of it is striking to me because it's anticipating. I mean, like when Putin had to make a speech saying people in the West talking about using nuclear weapons against Russia should realize the wind blows the other way too. And then that was converted into Putin threatens West with nuclear war instead of him reacting to this kind of provocative talk in the West about it. It just shows the mindset has lost the script and any sense of self-restraint. I mean, because basically what you see is there has, since the post-World War II era, been a mindset in parts of the American deep state that has not looked at allies, but looked at a dominant-subordinate relationship. But at least it tended not to be purely or consistently or always an abusive relationship. I mean, there are aspects. I mean, we tried to kill Mitterrand however many times. I mean, de Gaulle multiple times in France. Our complicity was all over the place there with Alan Dulles and others. So there was Operation Gladio and other things like that. But, not to the scale that we would blow up civilian infrastructure just to have leverage over Russia in a conflict that we're not even directly involved in. That's a kind of a different animal of a different breed. And it's become more of just a pure abuser-abused relationship. When I was representing victims of domestic violence, I remember a shrink explaining to me, in an abused or abuser relationship, there's never equality. You are either the abuser or you are the abused. And if you don't want to be the abused, become the abuser. And that's your only alternative in that relationship dynamic. And that's kind of what's happening here. And clearly nobody in Europe has any pushback at all. I mean, even the celebrated election in parts of the Western right of Meloni in Italy, she was eager to say she's very pro-NATO and very pro the war in Ukraine. And she was eager to, now maybe that's to buy time and buy political space to try to do what she wants to do on immigration and domestic policy, given she's got to get some EU permission effectively for a range of things, given Italy's financial issues. But that relates to another place where we just right now don't care or don't appear to care about the rest of the world. While there's a fair dispute and debate about whether or not interest rate rises by central banks necessarily make their currency stronger, there are several good analysts out there that there's actually not quite the correlation people think there is. And the real problem of the dollar's dominance and its negative adverse impact around the globe is that there's too much dollar-denominated debt and too much dollar dominance in currency transactions, and that's almost an incurable problem with inadequate dollar supply for a range of reasons. Putting that aside, it is at least popularly believed in many financial circles that the Fed increasing interest rates consistently, and it's clear that's going to keep marching on. They believe their credibility depends upon them continuing on the explicit and express path of rising interest rates, and have said They don't believe a soft landing will happen, and they want to see unemployment go way up. And until they see unemployment go way up in America, they're going to keep hiking. Well, the perception is that makes the dollar more dominant, and it leads to a currency war like what we're seeing around the globe. Japan, extraordinary intervention to try to salvage its currency. Even China had to step in when it got up over 7 yuan to the dollar and impose some restraints there. And then, of course, right now, most notoriously, is what is happening, though I think it's mostly self-inflicted. There's at least some blame in British financial circles on the Fed hiking interest rates constantly. What is happening to the pound? I mean, there's actual talk. Even Larry Summers was out saying, believes that the pound will be worth less than the dollar within the year. I mean, I remember it was like $1.60, $1.70 every time I went to UK. I mean, it was pricey. I mean, sterling. The word itself, the language itself meant prime. Well regarded, strong. You now look. I mean, the pound drops by 3-4%. There's a pension crisis. There's a financial liquidity crisis. The Bank of England has to reverse course from raising interest rates and quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, going in and buying bonds to keep them from collapsing. I mean, this is the prime finance for people that don't always appreciate it. London is still the financial center of the world, largely. I mean, it is the center, at least of the Western world. To see this happen in the UK, I mean, the last time it happened was when George Soros was lining his pockets, betting against the pound. So you wonder if he's still involved, but that's probably another story for another day, old Georgie. I'm sure he's making money either which way the way wind blows, but sometimes he helps the wind blow in certain ways. But Tuss, she comes in and her reaction is to let's do more stimulation. I mean, I get the idea of tax cuts, but combining where and how you're going to finance it with borrowings, basically you're going to stimulate an inflationary economy. That doesn't seem to be all that sensible. But what exactly is happening there in Britain?
This is exactly what you said. I mean, this is exactly what's happened. People have over-focused on the tax cuts. There's been too much attention given to the tax cuts. Tax cuts are actually reasonably minor, and there are some people who feel that overall they're probably beneficial to the economy if they were run properly. The problem is not the tax cuts. The problem is that the government is overspending. They're adding to the spending on a massive way. In fact, it's very like, in some ways, what the Biden administration was doing in its first year. We have had a dash for growth. We cut taxes. We increase spending. We try and increase liquidity across the system. We try to support the housing market. We've had many examples, by the way, of what's called the dash for growth policy in Britain since the 50s. But this has been done in a most extreme and eccentric way. So we have very high inflation in Britain, higher than in the United States. It's almost certainly well into double figures if you look at it properly. That inflation is undermining living standards. So you take that inflationary fire and you pour petrol on it, which is what you're doing with this, huge rush of extra spending on all kinds of things, like trying to control the household bills that people pay for their energy, things of this kind. I mean, so you do that, and then you say, well, inflation isn't going to take off. Nobody, of course, believes you. And then as you're increasing all that spending, you add even that tweak more by cutting taxes. So, of course, people are saying, this is irrational. This doesn't make any kind of sense. We're not going to get a dash for growth. We've already been there with the Biden administration. We saw it. We saw what happened there. We're in an even worse position than they're in. I mean, at least they got a reserve currency to, fall back on. And inflation, when they started, wasn't actually very high. But, now it's very high. And we don't even have a reserve currency in the way that the dollar is a reserve currency. So, of course, there's an absolute meltdown. There is a complete nervous collapse across the financial system here. And, the pound is important. The fall in sterling is important. And if sterling falls below parity, that will be a profound psychological shock for people in Britain, especially, by the way, if I may add, for people who vote Conservative. So, I mean, that will deepen the sense of crisis. But if you really want to know what was the actual epicenter of the turmoil, it was the government bond market, the gilt market, in other words. Because, of course, people looked at all of this and they said, the government wants us to lend them, hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds. And, they've given no plan of how they're going to pay this all back. They've given no structure for trying to restrain all this spending going forward. So, of course, what do? We pull out of gilts, and that's exactly what happened. So the Bank of England had to reverse its policy and resume QE, which, of course, it insisted and promised us it would never do. Now, Britain has its eccentricities. We have a very eccentric government. We have a Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is, by the way, somebody I know. I have to say that because people should be aware of the fact that I actually know Kwasi. But we have our Chancellor. We have who is as I said, very academic-minded person, very clever, but clever in my opinion in the way that academics are clever. Not somebody, I think, who has that feel for the pulse of commercial life, which, if you're really going to run an economy, is what you really need. But all right, we have our eccentricities and our peculiarities, but I'm going to say something. Britain is the canary in the coal mine. What has happened here in Britain over the last few days signals what is coming. Basically, the reason it happened was because the government, the British government, doesn't understand how bad the situation in the economy really is, how bad the situation in society really is. They thought they were in a much stronger position than they actually were in, and they thought they could therefore take risks with the economy, which of course they can't. And that delusion exists everywhere, at least in the West. It's a delusion that's shared still amongst the European economies. People in Germany still think it. I'm afraid there are even some people in the United States who are, I think, unduly complacent about how bad the situation is.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. Now, what do you think about? I've always thought that the British royalty as an institution was kind of past its expiration date, but for the Queen, that her personal popularity, magnanimous personality after Princess Di's death in particular, who I thought helped resurrect aspects of the institution. But, whenever I've been over in the UK, you do have this sort of strong respect still for the royal institutions. How much do you think it can last under a guy like Charles, particularly if he weaponizes it for climate change and things like that? I thought the Queen hid a lot of the questionable conduct of the royal family over time because of her personal likability and individual charm. Is it a sustainable institution with someone like Charles at the helm?
Right, straightforwardly, I don't think so. Now, the thing to understand about the Queen is that, of course, she became Queen in 1952. This is a completely different world from the world of today. I mean, Joseph Stalin was still running things in Moscow in 1952. That tells you how long she was Queen. And, of course, when she was Queen, Britain was an industrial power. It was the third biggest economy in the world. People tend to forget that. We had a major industrial base, and we still had a far-flung empire. We'd lost India a few years, 4 years before, but we had all the other parts of the empire. They were still, part of the great imperial system that had been built up before. So the Queen becomes Queen, taking over all of that. And she was a charming, young person, brought up, schooled in the concept of service, of loyalty to Britain. She'd played a role in a minor way in the Second World War. She'd actually enlisted in things. So she embodied all of those things. And she was obviously there as the Queen. Now, Britain changed and it contracted. It ceased to be an empire. It lost its industrial base. British society changed completely. It became much more, I would say, well, I'm going to use the word vulgar. It became much more vulgar. You only have to look at British tabloids to see how vulgar Britain has become. And the point to understand is throughout all of that change, one person remained the same, and that was the Queen. She was at the end essentially the same person that she had been in 1952, and that gave the British a tremendous sense of reassurance and stability. She was the rock upon which everything else spun. So, everything changed. There she was, Elizabeth R. And, we all looked up to her. Many of us who are not particularly monarchically minded. And we had this enormous respect. And she connected us to our past and helped us to manage this transition to a very chaotic present and a very uncertain future. And now she's gone. And that rock has gone. And we look at her successor, Charles, and, we find a rather eccentric figure, not perhaps with the self-discipline that his mother had. And then we look at the younger royals who will come after Charles, and he won't be king for very long because he's already well into his 70s. But we look at the other royals, and we see, instead of that sense of service that Elizabeth had, we see instead a sense of entitlement. And people are not going to like it. So I don't think it will survive. That's my own personal belief.
I'm always reminded of when the MI6 accidentally confused the Queen with a ship called the Queen in communicating to U.S. intelligence to convince the Shah of Iran during the planned coup in the 1950s that the Queen, who the Shah looked up to and had special particular deference and respect towards, was convinced by U.S. intelligence that the Queen herself wanted him to stay in Iran, not leave, so they could help stage the coup. And of course, who knows what would have happened? It turned out it wasn't the Queen. The MI6 accidentally confused that with a ship somehow in how they relayed the message. But the Brits were and the Americans were very interested in oil dominance in Iran, and all the CIA Kermit Roosevelt types had that sort of Lawrence of Arabia vision of who they were going to be. It's why they were Arabist, not so much pro-Israel. They were more Arabist and that's still strong within the CIA and State Department. Probably the biggest difference between neoliberals and neoconservatives is that approach on aspects of Israel and Iran. And now we've seen a very different Iran. And I can see two things at the same time being true. I can say the American populist perspective or inclination with something like Iran is twofold. We don't go abroad searching for monsters to destroy, so not interested in intervention, invasion, or the rest. But that doesn't preclude many in America from seeing Iran as a monster. The perspective, there's a good number of Iranians that I know in LA, and most Iranian Americans, Patrick Bet David, others that have some social media influence, very anti this Iranian government. People can take that for what it is. And they could see the possibility of deep state involvement with Iran. There's some articles out today about whether the CIA screwed up its efforts to undermine Iran and some things like basically more CIA screw ups. No surprise there. But it's one of those situations, kind of like when we, saw the rumors of a coup in China, that getting honest information is difficult because the Iranian regime is not exactly the most open press regime in the world. And so, and the deep state is more than capable of staging color revolutions throughout the Arab world like anywhere else. So it's figuring out how much of this is organic, how much of this is authentic, how much of this is even consequential. Sometimes I get pushback where people are like, why are Americans anti-Iran, aside from the issue of Israel? There's that wing of the American right that's very aligned with Israel, that's anti-Iran because Israel sees it as Iran is a major threat to their security and well-being. Take that for whatever you want to. It's because this regime introduced itself by holding Americans hostage. So, that's the first part of the American knowledge of this regime. The second is, when they see Death to America chants at every weekend parade. So there's within the American political right, there's not going to be a lot of sympathy for Iran. There's probably less sympathy for Iran than almost any other regime not named China in the American political right. Take that, but that doesn't mean people are for interventions, invasions, wars. The whole foundational principle of American populist foreign policy was the great speech that said, we do not go abroad searching for monsters to destroy. Doesn't mean we don't see something as a monster, but sometimes when people see American right hostility to Iran, they interpret that to mean, sure, go in and let's try another Afghanistan, another Iraq, another Libya, another Syria. That's not the case, at least within the populist right. Some of the neocon right would love to overthrow Iran, regime change in Iran. But how much of what you've seen is real and not real in Iran? How much of it is a threat of major revolt and repression? How much of it is kind of not that big a deal and being exaggerated? What's your read on it, given the difficulty of source accuracy here in the States?
Right. Well, can I say, first of all, there's a lot of Iranians in Britain, and I have a lot of Iranian acquaintances. The first thing I'm going to say is that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the regime in Iran. There's an awful lot of dissatisfaction with the regime amongst Iranians. This is not something that is invented. There's a widespread feeling that Iran is underperforming, that it's a developed country, it's an educated country, it could do an awful lot better if it was better run, and the way that the regime operates keeps it back, holds it back in many ways. And there's intense frustration, not just amongst women, but amongst a lot of Iranians about the various extreme social controls that exist in Iran, which we must always understand. Like always, when controls are imposed, you see this in the United States in a completely different way. When you have people looking out all the time for misbehavior, it's also a way of political control, and that does cause resentments. Now, having said that, the one thing I have always and invariably found is that the one thing that makes Iranians come together and say, well, we can't push things too far, is a sense that whatever is going on in their country, when there's protests, that the United States, the CIA, whatever it is, the outside adversary, if you like, is out there controlling it or manipulating it. I think if people in the United States want to see change happen in Iran, the simplest and most effective thing they could do was to leave it alone. I think the Iranians themselves would do it. If there was no sense in Iran or amongst Iranians that, if we come out and protest, somebody, this big, powerful country, far away, which is adversarial to us, will come in and reorder things and take us back to where we were in the 1970s, which most Iranians absolutely do not want. They have very vivid memories of the time, when the Shah was there. So if that possibility is taken away, if that threat does not exist, then you would probably see, in fact, I am sure you would see, change in Iran happen much more quickly. Now, I say that, I don't pretend to be an Iranian expert, but it is consistent. What I'm saying is consistent with what I'm hearing from Iranians I know, and it's consistent with what I'm seeing about these protests. I think they're real. I think they're widespread. I think the regime will eventually bring them under control, as it always has done. I think its security apparatus is big enough, and it still has that legitimacy and that critical mass of support in Iran, partly because it is seen as the protection of Iran from the adversary far away.
I mean, another place where there was talk of regime change that didn't make sense, that really impaired the credibility of certain anti-China media institutions here in the States, was all the talk that Xi had been sacked. I mean, it was all over the place. And it's like, I think he picks who runs the military, so I don't
Yes.
think they would have sacked him. I think they have serious economic issues because of figuring out how they're going to handle the real estate economy. I didn't realize how big it was until I did kind of a deep dive into the topic. And, you know, you're talking about as many as 1 in 4 Chinese jobs are directly or indirectly based on the real estate economy, and how much China used they built something that got out of control. And when they tried to put the brakes on, it hit too hard. And now they're trying to figure out a balance, and how well they figure that out will be tricky. And they got the Party Congress up in October. But to the chat question early, I mean, to my knowledge, there was never any grounds to believe there was regime change happening in Xi. I mean, Xi, I think he'll win the election stay ahead of the party. Well, what are your thoughts on that whole story and how it got around so quickly?
I know, it's absolutely bizarre, actually. Now, you know, I went to the Foreign Ministry website, which is the Chinese Foreign Ministry website, and there we go. There, you know, there were all the things there. You know, President Xi met so and so. President Xi spoke to so and so. Now, admittedly, they were things that had happened a little, you know, about a week before. But if there'd been some kind of political coup or something like that was happening, then the first indicator that there is a coup, the first sign that somebody is about to fall, is that his name disappears. And Xi's name was not disappearing. I mean, you go back, you know, to Soviet times. I mean, it was the first clue people got that Khrushchev was in trouble was when somebody arrived at Moscow airport, and there were the people there, the workers there, taking his picture down. So you know, that's the way these sort of regimes work. So, I mean, one, it made no sense. I mean, he seemed very much in control. Only a short time before, he'd been to Samarkand, he'd had all those meetings there with all those people. There was no sense at that point that he was, you know, his power was slipping from his hands. He came with an enormous delegation, by the way, teams of experts, including military people. He seems securely at the top of the political structure in China. The way the political structure in China operates is that I would have thought it'd be almost impossible to organize a coup against him, either from within the Communist Party or from within the army. I mean, the idea that the Chinese Communist Party would act against the leader, the head of the Communist Party of China, I would have thought was inconceivable, having been there. This is a country where there's blanket surveillance, so any kind of plotting would be detected pretty much immediately. I mean, the whole thing just didn't make any kind of sense. And yes, there are economic problems, and they're real, and we'll talk about them. But I don't think we're in a position of economic crisis or anything like that. And if anything, the effect of an economic problems in China would make, or so I would have thought, the entire system want to hold together even more under the boss. That's my own sense of this. So, I mean, the whole thing didn't make any kind of sense to me. There was no reality to it. You saw pictures coming out of Beijing where everything seemed to be entirely normal. People were moving around, in their restaurants, the cafes, looking at all the various sites. I mean, it just didn't make any sense that there was a coup. So the big question is, who spread the story? And that leads to two questions. Did it originate in China? Was somebody trying to embarrass Xi because he's about to be crowned, leader again for the third time? Or was something else going on? Was it an external force that was also trying in some ways to create problems for Xi from abroad? And curiously enough, on this occasion, I lean, if anything, slightly towards the first theory. Not that there is real opposition to Xi from within the governmental structure, but that there may be some people who are unhappy and who spread this story about Xi in order to take the shine off his parade, which is about to come, and perhaps to give the impression that there are more cracks in the system, the political system, than there really are.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Mm.
Speaking of elections, my take on, I like some of Maloney's speeches
Yeah.
in terms of family, in terms of womanhood, in terms of
Yeah.
traditional values, in terms of anti-wokeism. I like her making fun of Macron because that's always fun. I like her, and I think her sense of boundaries about immigration. I mean, I was there a few years ago, and I was in very liberal areas, left areas, ex-communist strongholds, with people that were otherwise, very clearly left and politically ancestrally left. And when the issue of immigration came up, I mean, there was some very, let's just put it this way, very politically incorrect language used. I mean, I was shocked. I mean, I grew up in the American South, and I was like, whoa, I haven't heard that in 50 years. So that kind of, so I realized that immigration hostility was deep, deep, deep. And when you went to places, it was like everyday Italian culture. In other words, you go to the local store, and there's a migrant standing outside it that just kind of stares at you, which was weird to me. But it was, and you go to the center of Venice, that famous square in Venice, and there were migrants interfering with people who were trying to do things. So I was like, okay, Italians are not going to sit well with this. So I get that, but there's all the real pro-NATO statements, the pro-Ukraine statements, the pro-war with Russia statements. And then there's the practical limitations on what she can actually do in terms of governance. And then you have the smarter, sager old hands like Berlusconi as being part of the coalition. How much of this victory is symbolic versus substantive? Like, I like what Orban is going to do by holding a referendum on whether sanctions are a good idea. That'll be wonderfully embarrassing to the EU because we can guess how the Hungarians are likely going to vote. But beyond this symbolism, will there be substantive reform on EU-related issues or others in Italy?
I don't think anybody can answer that question at the moment. Now, I'm going to say a few things about Maloney. Now, Maloney, for me, actually is the closest approximation we have produced in Europe so far to Donald Trump. I mean, I don't want to, overstate the similarities, and obviously they come from very different economic, socioeconomic backgrounds. I mean, but the fact is, if you see her on the campaign trail, if you see the way she relates to Italians, is able to talk to them, clearly likes them, has this enormous empathy with them and they with her, I have to say it reminded me of the way I've seen Donald Trump when he works crowds in the United States. I mean, she's the only political leader in Europe, for me, who comes close to this. And she's obviously a very tough, savvy political operator. I mean, she's had to fight against hideous odds to become Prime Minister of Italy. I mean, she took over a party which is essentially a moribund party. She's got a very clear definition. She's a social conservative, a Christian. She's a defender of Italian values. She says things that Italians have been yearning to hear for a very long time. They related to her very well. She stood against Mario Draghi's government when everybody else joined it. And that, again, identified her as a person of some integrity because she wasn't going to be bought with a ministerial post. At the same time, she comes to the office of Prime Minister with many, many problems. Some of them, I think, are self-created in the sense that I don't think she's a person with a very sophisticated knowledge of the world. I think she has this great admiration. I think this is a genuine admiration for the United States. But I think she conflates that with NATO, with the Atlanticist system. I don't think she understands the extent to which she's up against a two-headed monster, that the EU and the NATO combinat are one and the same to all intents and purposes. They're all part of this Brussels structure, which, if she's not very careful, will want to devour her. So I don't think she understands that. But, and this is the important thing, if you look at her base, if you look at the opinions of her electoral base, and I'm taking this now entirely from opinion polls that I've seen, they tend to be much more critical of NATO, of sanctions, of the economic war, of all of those things than Maloney herself has been. So she's actually somewhat out of tune with her base on these issues. Now, given how close she is to her base, I do wonder whether eventually she will be pulled back to it, and whether she's really the kind of political leader who will break with her base on issues of that importance, especially when she comes to realize that, as I said, it's a two-headed monster that she's up against. That if you go along with the EU policies on Russia, then being realistic about it, you're not going to achieve very much in Italy, because everything is connected. You can't revive the Italian economy until you take steps to sort of reintegrate things in the European economy. And that means talking to the Russians and trying to find some kind of way out of the sanctions war. So that's what I'm going to say at the moment. I think it's a tough call. She's up against many problems. She's facing the fact that the European Central Bank is the biggest single holder of Italian debt, which gives it enormous power over Italy. She's got an implacable opponent in the Commission. I don't know whether she quite realizes how implacable that opponent actually is. And of course, within Italy itself, I think she has a lot of support, a critical mass of support, but there are still very powerful forces, extremely powerful forces, that are willing her to fail. So this is going to be a tough call. She could change things in Italy. She'll have to work in a very consistent way to do so. And she'll have to show a lot more understanding of politics, and she'll have to seek advice from people who can advise her in a realistic way.
Well, speaking of settlement proposals with Russia and Ukraine, two recent mediation proposals made. One, I'm hoping Putin or Russia welcomes publicly, just because it would be great fun to troll the West. Because Trump has offered himself. He said, I can mediate this. If I was president, this wouldn't even happen. So just let me sit down. I'll get the deal done. Everybody be happy. Everybody be no nuclear war. None of this. As he pointed out recently, Jimmy Carter gets a bad rap. It was unlike Joe Biden. He didn't create the crises that the world is suffering. So I would love to see Putin and Russia put out a statement. We welcome Donald Trump as a potential mediator in these, because what's the U.S. or West going to do? They can't say yes for obvious reasons. People don't know, years ago, Trump had proposed himself to resolve certain issues in Central America for the Reagan administration. The CIA nixed it because they suspected that Trump was a secret peacenik. By the way, it's just one of those things. He actually was critical of the Vietnam War back in the early 70s. Side of that, there are aspects of his instincts that have been long established. Trade and foreign war are two of them, but just many didn't know about it. Sometimes masked by his macho rhetoric. It's that combination of appealing to muscular military streak of American populism with non-intervention streak of populism, and Trump better match those two than anybody. But what do you make of the Saudis' attempts to apparently mediate? Because what's interesting is MBS, this is where there's a bit of a neoliberal neocon split. Trump was trying to align the administration toward the end, the royals and the Israelis together, and to rebuild that bridge between those two, between Israel and the royals, and thought alliance with the royals made more sense over time from an American realistic geopolitical perspective. The Obama administration was kind of skeptical of the Saudis, and the Washington Post, the Bezos Post, the CIA Post, notoriously put certain people on their payroll, pretended they were journalists, and then they went to the Saudi embassy. Why you go to the Saudi embassy when you know that they're hostile to you for your marriage license? I don't know, but they never come out. But there's been, Biden, of course, with his loose lips, has said very anti-MBS rhetoric. Key members of the Biden administration have done that. I think that's part of what's motivating MBS, talking about Saudis joining BRICS. That he is just hostile, or he sees the Biden administration as hostile to him, and he's reciprocating in kind. But what do you? And I think part of why he's trying to sort of upstage the West in promoting himself, and Erdogan trying to get back in the action as the guy with 1 foot in the West and 1 foot in BRICS at the same time. But what do you make? But theoretically, there's no reason why they couldn't be an effective mediator. I'm only skeptical of it because I think Ukraine is just a puppet regime. Yeah. And Putin himself now went public with what you guys talked about all the way back. Russia clearly thought they had a deal in Ankara, and that Bojo and Biden killed it.
No.
And so, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think you've summed it up actually pretty well, because if you look at MBS, one thing that comes across to me about MBS is a dripping contempt and dislike of Joe Biden. And by the way, I don't think he's the only Saudi the only member of the Saudi royal firmament who has that contempt for Biden. I think Saudi Arabia collectively has taken one look at this administration and they've concluded that they don't like it. So it makes a great deal of sense for them to come up with a mediation proposal, because, of course, what they're doing this way is that they're able to establish some kind of communications channel to the Russians. They can talk to the Russians about lots of things. They can talk about arms sales, about oil, about all kinds of other things. But at the same time, they can say, look, we're not against Ukraine. We're not siding with Russia over Ukraine. What we're trying to be is an honest broker. We're trying to mediate with them. And that's what the Saudis are all about. Now, from a Russian point of view, it works in exactly the same way. They want to have good terms with Saudi Arabia. After all, they have this oil alliance with the Saudis, very useful to the Russians, particularly at this time. They've got all kinds of big plans in the Middle East. They want to rebuild Syria. They want to forge ahead, with all the plans, that they want to consolidate their positions in the Middle East. But the oil alliance, obviously, is for them the most important. They also want Saudi investment in Russia. They want the Saudis to be involved in many things in Russia. So again, very excellent. We can talk to the Saudis. Got lots of things to talk about, because you see, the Saudis are trying to mediate this Ukraine conflict. They're arranging for our prisoners to be exchanged for the prisoners that we have, the Ukrainian prisoners that we have. So we have every good reason to talk to them. I think neither party, neither the Saudis nor the Russians, seriously believe that whatever mediation proposal Saudi Arabia is putting together, that the Ukrainians or the United States are ever going to buy it. So it's a wonderful way for these two countries to continue with their dialogue, to continue with their partnership. And Saudi Arabia is indeed looking at joining the BRICS. And it's now become a dialogue member, a second member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So you can see that it's starting to edge away, to distance itself from the United States. Now, given what an important ally Saudi Arabia has been for the United States, if you know anything about Middle Eastern history, you will know that the central alliance in the Arab world that enabled the United States to hold its influence in the Arab world was its alliance with the Saudis. It was the Saudi alliance. It was the rock upon which the US built its Arab policy. The fact that Trump wanted to revive it is an indicator for me of his realism. You might not think much of the Saudis. I'll be honest, I don't. I've no particular time for the Saudis at all. I've no time for the Saudis at all. But if you take a realpolitik position, which is what Trump was doing, put all that aside about what you feel about the Saudis, forging that friendship with the Saudis, hardening up that alliance was in America's interest. It led to the Abraham Accords. It wouldn't have been possible to have the Abraham Accords and all that unless Trump had Saudi Arabia on side to a great extent. Obama, Biden, they've managed to wreck their relationship, the US relationship with the Saudis. And I think they assumed that the Saudis would always stick with the US, however unhappy they were with the administration. And in fact, what's happening instead is that the Saudis have looked at Obama and what happened under him. They've looked at what's going on with Biden, and they're tiptoeing away. They're saying there's other people in other places, other countries. Russia is one, China is another, India maybe a third. We've got good relations already with Pakistan. We're tiptoeing away because we got potential other friends.
Yeah. And speaking, I mean, a lot of our policies don't seem to have respect for tradition, for past, for precedent. And like when the pipeline incident occurred, some people asked me why I, came to the conclusion quickly and conclusively it was the Biden administration. Aside from the fact that military people that I know explained why and how and predicted certain things would show up if I researched them, and by golly, they did. Is this administration has no respect for limits, period. Things that I thought they wouldn't limits, I thought they would at least respect in aspects of January 6th, in aspects of Trump, in aspects of various forms of lawfare. Right now, we have them trying to lock up protesters, many people who committed no violent crime of any kind. They didn't kill anybody on January 6th. The January 6th deaths were Trump supporters killed by Capitol Police and others. They including being shot at point blank, an unarmed individual. And yet many of them are being locked up, detained without trial for over now almost 2 years, going on 2 years. I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, going on 2 years almost, and some trials are just now starting. Information coming out littered with informants and infiltrators across the board. Feds were all over the place on January 6th. And major questions about that, but they're showing no limits. Ridiculous sentences, judges doing long lectures from the bench. This corrupt District of Columbia, that if Republicans are serious at all about draining the swamp, they can legally get rid of the District of Columbia as a federal jurisdiction. It's created by Congress. They can say no more jury pools that are just in D.C. Project Veritas just got a 6-figure verdict based on doing undercover investigative reporting, because now that's illegal in the District of Columbia, apparently. And they issue ridiculous verdicts, not as ridiculous as the Alex Jones verdicts, but still ridiculous verdicts that are discouraging undercover reporting. Here you have an organization like Project Veritas outing corruption and collusion in the elections and the Biden administration, and they're under criminal investigation in New York and civil suit in D.C. for doing so, while the criminals, the Biden administration, are protected. While at the same time, they're raiding President Trump's house, aspects of the so-called classified materials, which under law, it's whatever the president says is what's classified. Everybody's power comes from the president. There's no power that exists outside of the president. And yet we have an 11th Circuit Court of Appeals that's so intimidated by the word classified, so intimidated by the national security state, that they write long apologies for them and say that once classified, a president can't even keep his own records and they're no longer presidential records. Insane interpretation, directly contrary to prior case law in America, the only prior case law in America, when Bill Clinton stuck his tapes that he'd done with various biographers about information, and while he was in the White House, stuck them in his sock drawer. And they said that information, regardless of whether it was classified, was up to the president whether he got to keep it or the National Archives did. Obama stuck his classified records in a strip mall outside Chicago that anybody could have walked into. And yet, again, nothing done. But Trump, now facing major criminal investigation, already had the raid, more talk of indictment, which to me is insane. but it didn't stop them from raiding him in the first place. And all the information developed reaffirms what we talked about right after the raid happened. This was a deep state raid, is a deep state cover-up operation for deep state crimes. And they, as Julian Assange exposed, rely upon secrecy for their criminality. And you aren't supposed to keep secrets. They're supposed to spy on everything you do, from your smartphone to your little computer, your computer to your little thermostat, you name it. But they are supposed to be able to keep from you, the elected people who put them in power, the electorate, all of their own crimes and criminality and complicity. And they're now being open and overt about it and trying to create legal precedents in America that the deep state gets to decide what's classified, not the elected president. And the deep state can put the elected president in prison if he keeps evidence of their crimes. In the same capacity, you have the New York Attorney General who ran on an election of elect me, I'll get Trump. That was actually key part of her platform, is now seeking legal action and her goal is for the New York courts to strip Trump of all of his assets, to impose a receiver over all of his organizations, to strip him of all entities' legal rights to do business in New York, to deny him the ability to ever borrow money ever, because any bank of any quality is licensed in New York. So he could never borrow money again. And his family, strip his family of ever being able to do business of any kind in New York, based on solely whether or not Trump brags a lot. I mean, that's literally the basis of the claim. Oh, Trump bragged about his assets. We're going to call that fraud on the people of New York. Even though there's no loan, he's never failed to pay back. No tax, he's failed to pay. They couldn't allege any tax evasion at all. Put him under 2 years of microscopic investigation. And all they come up with is Trump brags a lot. And for that reason, we want to strip him of all of his money, all his resources, all his power, all his business. And it shows this has never happened in America before. None of it. So it's
why is this being allowed to happen, Robert? Why? I mean,
it's a complete lack of respect for boundaries. They don't believe in boundaries. Take the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. These are two deep state institutions that have long served deep state priorities. However, because they mostly targeted unlikable dissidents, it was like MK Ultra. They experimented on the mentally ill, the prisoners, forced sterilizations, targeted orphanages and poor populations and prisons. The FBI got away with it because they weren't overtly partisan between the two major parties. They never went after big institutional actors, and they had the almost complete, and they used anti-communism as the guise, and consequently had deep support from the political right in America. Now, even the National Review, the neocon Republican establishment National Review, has a lead article this week saying time to get rid of the FBI. So, I mean, they are doing things that, again, show no respect for second-order consequences. It's just a complete lack of restraint. It's striking to witness. It's like a spoiled 8-year-old with complete power who's suddenly become king and just can't stop himself. It's like something out of a Game of Thrones episode. Just no sense of self-restraint, no sense of restriction. Part of this is a privileged class. Peter Thiel calls it the educational bubble, calls it the worst bubble that exists. This privileged, protected class that has grown up, nurtured amongst themselves, believe in safe spaces, don't interact with people who disagree with you, don't pay attention to people who disagree with you. See anyone who does, like the New Zealand Prime Minister's speech at the UN, as a threat and is almost terroristic. You disagree with me? That's not just free speech. That's now terroristic threats that you belong in prison. It's the same mindset, same mentality. Because I've been shocked. I mean, I thought there were places like, they're not going to breach that precedent. And then they breach it. Like, well, they won't go that far. And then they do. They're clearly obsessed with Trump. Now, there's an effort afoot that to try to create the impression. They're trying to take out Trump and DeSantis at the same time by trying to create an impression that Trump and DeSantis don't like each other and are bashing each other in secret. I know the evidence is just the opposite. So there's no bad blood between the two at all. The plan is for Trump and DeSantis to run as a ticket in 2024. They both actually like and respect one another. It is in DeSantis's interest, if he has deep state skepticism, to keep it to himself for reasons that he can watch with Trump. But their goal, the way you can kind of know this, is most of the sources that are reporting this, Maggie Haberman, the New York Times, other publications, hate Trump and hate DeSantis. That's a sign that this is not a legitimate organic. They're trying to create a situation where they take both out by getting each the fans of each to hate the other. That's the objective. It's not going to work. DeSantis doesn't care, brushes all this off. DeSantis gave a very anti-World Economic Forum style speech recently when he said Florida is where the model, and the language he used was that way. But it's in his interest to not be too open. I get concerned. There's legitimate. I have questions about what DeSantis thinks about foreign policy because we don't know for the most part. And he's got people around him that had ties to Ukraine. So that was the reason for, there's still reason for be skepticism. But I'll be honest, if he was on the deep state side of the equation, he stayed unusually mute when almost every other politician in the state has embraced, in the country, has embraced the Ukrainian conflict. You'll find almost no statements from DeSantis on it, which is a sign that he's more aligned probably with Trump than. And once I saw this leaking of attacks between the two, you would only do that if you're the deep state apparatus, if you don't like either and don't trust either. But it's open, overt legal warfare, lawfare against Trump, to where they're literally trying to strip him of everything, his freedom, his liberty. Now, constitutionally, it can't change his qualifications to be on the ballot. So they can't prevent him from running. There were people who thought, oh, there's a disqualification clause in certain criminal statutes. Doesn't apply to the president. Constitution trumps. So they can't. And I think the deep state actually was, in the establishment, was surprised, because you've seen articles in the New York Times, the Atlantic, and some other places. They're like, oh, man, Trump's popularity went up after the raid. That wasn't supposed to happen. They're still that delusional, disconnected. But the FBI is actually on the verge of real institutional reform for the first time since the mid-1970s, which they managed to dodge extraordinarily. I mean, they got a little bit of it, but not much reform. The Justice Department. I mean, because everybody is seeing on the last bastion of support for what I always considered lawless institutions, but for which the right thought were protecting their institutional interest, ideological interest, has now lost that. And ordinary people want the Justice Department shrunk. Ordinary people want the D.C. district gone. Ordinary people want FBI gone. And the more they go after institutional actors like Mike Lindell and other players, people with money, people with resources, people with connections, the more they go after the Peter Navarros and the Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon now prosecuted again in New York for what he was pardoned for by the President Trump on, again, a victimless crime. Like they couldn't identify any person that Trump had victimized in the actions to strip him of all his money, property, and his family of all money and property. They couldn't identify any victim in the Steve Bannon case. They're like, well, he made certain statements that didn't turn out accurate in how the funds were spent. But nobody's complaining. So, I mean, it's like, what? But why is there this case? And, the only reason they weren't able to get convictions in the Build the Wall case in the federal court in New York was because an honest, conscientious person got on the jury and he's like, this is a political hit job. I'm not going to be part of it. In the Southern District of New York, you have a little bit better chance of getting that than in D.C., but it's still a very corrupted jurisdiction. So it's basically no holds barred. Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, author, was on Sidebar with us yesterday, and he was talking about what Dinesh D'Souza had been talking about, which was it's time for the us outsiders to recognize we're in a second civil war and respond accordingly. In other words, if they're going to weaponize every legal system politically, the only thing that's going to stop them is if we reverse, we do the same. And so you're seeing more talk of, why don't small county prosecutors? I mean, Hunter Biden committed a crime in every state he walked into. Maybe it's time to criminally indict him and look at it, right? So, but they don't even think that's possible. They don't think the right will ever return in kind their own tactics and techniques. And that's part of their reasoning. But otherwise, it's just a sense of limitlessness, no sense of respect for law, boundary, precedent, custom, tradition, nothing.
This is absolute legal anarchy of the worst kind. I mean, I've never known anything like it. And just to add to that list of horrors that you've set out, Robert, and by no means the worst one. I mean, it's less bad than some, but, it's one that I know all about. Subpoenas abused in the most horrific way. I mean, there was this mass, sending out of subpoenas to ask people, to give evidence, keep all this evidence and provide all this evidence. And I mean, fishing expeditions, we used to have this concept in law that you don't undertake fishing expeditions. You don't use the legal system for fishing expeditions. But now this Justice Department is absolutely happy, apparently, to do those sort of things. I have never seen anything like this in my life. People held in detention for 2 years in over an episode where, as I understand it, by far the most widely cited offence was one of trespass. Trespass. I mean, yeah, talk of an insurrection involving an event where scarcely anybody came armed. And this is in the United States, where everybody has the right to carry arms. I mean, it is sheer anarchy is loosed upon the world. You know, what is it? Those words of Yeats. You know, the best lack all conviction, and the worst are filled with passionate intensity. Because this is what is coming. This is what has happened. And, you know, for someone like myself, you know, who worked for a time in, you know, the Royal Courts of Justice, and who had this huge admiration for the Constitution of the United States and what it stood for. And this is the desecration of the temple. I can't begin to express in words how upsetting this is for me. Now, all right, I mean, you know, what do I matter? I'm one person. I'm not even American. It doesn't affect me directly, though, of course, it does affect me, because what goes on in the United States affects everyone. But that Americans are watching this and seeing this done to themselves, the only way that it can happen, I can imagine, is that, you know, that this is able to happen, and the way, to the extent that it can, is because of information control in the United States, which must be so pervasive and so terrible that, I mean, it really has convinced a lot of people that black is white and white is black, and what is terrible and wrong and manifestly so is good. You know, it just horrifies me that things like this could be happening in the US today, and that the law, or that the instruments of the law, because it's not the law has nothing to do with this, it's the mechanics of the law, are being twisted in order to destroy one individual, to prevent him becoming president again. And perhaps not even for that reason. I mean, just to destroy him, because, you know, he was president for a time. I mean, again, that is something that I would never have imagined ever happening in America.
Well, it's what they mean by threat to democracy. They mean their rule of the elites, by the elites, for the elites, of the administrative state, by the bureaucratic state, for the deep state. These are people that, when I was in D.C., at the time of the inauguration, I was at the Deplore Ball and some other events, hanging out with Peter Thiel and some other people. And I was telling everybody, it was like, this town is going to hate this man. They are accustomed to running things the way they want. They're going to react the way Alan Dulles and the CIA reacted to JFK acting like he was actually the boss and not them. And the, you know, Eisenhower's great farewell speech. Everybody remembers the military industrial complex part. They forget his warning about the scientific technological elite that was going to both corrupt government and be corrupted by government, with all these federal largesse programs increasingly controlling their funding and their political prestige and power. And we're seeing it and witnessing it in live time in the Fauci's of the world. Fauci's is more like it. But an example of this is where food policy around the globe is coming home to America. What the Bill Gates Foundation, World Bank, and IMF have done to small farmers throughout the world, famously to protest in places like from India to Africa to Latin America, now coming home to the United States in a case that I'm handling, a little Amish farmer, Amos Miller. So this is a guy who has made food the same way his community of Amish faith has for a long time. Their community, by almost every metric, physical, medical, psychological metric, is healthier and better off than the average person in the United States or in the West. They make food in a way that's consistent with their religious values, their community of faith. And in this case, it's exactly what his consumers want, his customers want. His customers come to him wanting food the way he makes it. They don't want food the way the U.S. Department of Agriculture wants it made. They don't want food the way big agriculture makes it. The whole history of agricultural regulation started off as, disguised as, food safety and food health. It was mostly a marketing technique, but it was mostly about Europe using Upton Sinclair's The Jungle to say you can't buy American meat because there's probably some human parts in there. So big agriculture wanting to also use regulatory capture to wipe out its smaller competitors in the States, but most importantly, to maintain entrance into the European market, got Teddy Roosevelt to create the Meat Act and the Poultry Act, and ultimately led to the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a marketing technique, also to improve its monopolistic power in the domestic marketplace. That is now being converted. Congress always promised this will never touch the family farm. This will never govern what you make for yourself at home. Well, the Amos Miller case proves that was a lie, because even though the law says that, that's not what the Department of Agriculture is doing. They are right now, Amos Miller, come Halloween this year, hearing on October 31st, they are asking for him to be put into prison until he does what the government demands he do. And what does the government demand he do? Pay over $300,000, have a monetary judgment issued against both he and his wife that could strip him of all of his farms and all of his land and all of his property and all of his wealth, unless he agrees to the U.S. Department of Agriculture controlling how he makes food. This is about this is about food and farms, and fundamentally about control. Do we get to control as ordinary people what we eat, what we put in our own bodies? This is what the vaccine mandate fight was all about. And we've seen how that worked out for the government, how their predictions about its safety and efficacy and whether it was even a vaccine, how that looks when you have prominent British doctors, prominent German doctors, prominent Polish doctors, prominent American doctors, just in the last 2 weeks that were very pro-vaccine, come out and say this was a bad idea. Why? One of them had their cancer accelerate and escalate after they took the vaccine. Another one, the British doctor, saw his father die from that he attributes to being caused by the vaccine. We have all the extraordinary actuarial data that shows unusual death rates amongst young men in America and in parts of the world that correlate directly with taking the vaccine. And here we have them wanting to control food. And who is the biggest agriculture landowner individually in the United States? Who is the person the most involved in global food issues? Same guy, the biggest one that's most involved in the global vaccine and the global pandemic policy issues. One, Bill Gates. This is a guy who wants us to eat synthetic corn and fake meat. And so basically the USDA is doing Bill Gates's bidding when they're willing and ready and able to take out a small Amish farmer. And the reason why they thought they could get away with it is the Amish don't believe in bringing attention to yourself. So they don't do publicity tours. They don't do public attention. Second, they don't believe in being involved in the legal system as much as you can avoid it. They're old school. Let's get along. Let's resolve this between ourselves, through our community, our traditions, etc. So the U.S. government and the court imposed on him a lawyer, despite him saying he had fired the lawyer and begging he be removed for the case from a year, a lawyer who had a long record of ethics complaints publicly in Texas, multiple suspensions, which is very rare to take. I mean, when you're the bottom of the barrel of the Texas bar, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. And this lawyer was forced on the guy. So that gives you an idea of where the legal system, this power grab, stays uncontained. And it's like the Ukrainian war. Well, when you start to get into places you don't belong, the great movie Sand Pebbles, detailing that's the real thematic structure of that film. We didn't belong in China in the 1920s, trying to patrol the rivers and the creeks and whatnot. And the same is true writ large of what's happening. Once you contaminate core principles, once you breach the foundation of what you believe and support by engaging in this kind of international adventurism beyond the rubric of law and the realm of principle, it comes back home. And now it's coming back home to everywhere. It's coming back about medicine, food, farm, politics, law, you name it. The Popular Front strategy of the Biden administration and sort of the wokest left to influence, like they're all little Gromskys walking through all the institutions, capturing them. And they believe in weaponizing everything. This is why you run into a boss that will weaponize it. This is like somebody spoke out in my hometown, Chattanooga, Tennessee, against them putting on a drag festival for little kids without the parents knowing. That's because most of us don't want people teaching 6-year-olds about sexual identity or doing strip shows for them. It's like, that's really not that radical a principle. Maybe it is in Paris. Maybe it is in parts of London these days. Maybe it is in New York City, but not in Middle America, not in, frankly, the rest of the world. But we are against a system and group of people that will weaponize everything and show no restraint, no respect, kind of like the French Revolution. Ultimately, they killed their own. When you don't respect the tradition or the past at all, you have no sense of custom, no sense of self-limitation. That's when the world gets very dangerous indeed.
Well, indeed, absolutely. And can I just say, I hope your Amish farmer wins. I think he's going to get excellent representation. I think justice is clearly on his side. This is one of the most oppressive cases, again, I've ever heard of. I mean, poor man is all I can say. I mean, having the entire might of the Department of Agriculture coming against you because you are trying to run your own farm in your own way, consistent with your religious beliefs. It seems astonishing. It seems incredible. I mean, as far as I can see, they're not accusing him of any, poisoning anybody or doing anything of that kind. So
no victims. There are no victims at all.
In
fact, it's what his customers want. They're trying to deprive them of what they want.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's classical misuse of power, political power, on behalf of corporate interests. They don't probably like these smallholders who probably producing better food than they produce, and food which might actually be more, might be more attractive, not just to people who share this person's religious views, but I can imagine other people wanting to come to this person because they probably trust his food more than they trust what they get in some grocery stores I'm not going to name. And look, as a result, the whole machinery of the state is unleashed on him in this hideous way. What was the United States when it was first created? It was predominantly a nation of smallholders, of people working the land and rearing raising their crops and rearing their animals and making their food. I mean, that was the basis of the United States. If you told the people who drew up the Constitution, the founders of the United States, that a case like this had been brought by an instrument of the very government that they were creating, they would have, I think they would have been shocked and disbelieving. And I have to say, to some extent, I am.
Yeah. I only had one more question before we wrap. What do you think is going to happen in the Brazilian elections? I originally thought Bolsonaro didn't have much chance, way behind Lula coming back out. But the polls have been tightening. And, of course, Brazil is infamously difficult to poll in the first place. For those that are out there, in terms of the U.S. elections, it's going to be a Republican sweep. I'm doing a What Are the Odds show every Tuesday night, 7 Eastern, with Richard Barris, People's Pundit. And he, best pollster in the country for the last decade. He agrees it's going to be, my guess, to over 240 Republicans in the House after the midterms. Republicans are going to win the Senate, I think at least +2, up to +4 Senate seats. They're going to take back at least 2 of the 3 governorships in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. They're going to win Ohio. J.D. Vance and Blake Masters, I think, are both going to be in the Senate, which will provide some important populist voices, despite Mitch McConnell and deep state allies trying to sabotage both of their candidacies, and both in the primary and even in the general, in the case of Blake Masters. And Laxalt, who I know here in Nevada, is likely to pick up the vote, though there will be some interesting mail-in balloting that may occur here in Nevada. And even New Hampshire, Colorado, and Washington are not completely out of reach for Republicans, whereas Uncle Festerman is unlikely to prevail for the Democratic Party there in Pennsylvania against Dr. Oz, despite limitations of his candidacy and campaign. And Ron Johnson, who's boldly taken stands against pandemic policies, is going to win actually pretty comfortably in Wisconsin. And for 2024, for those on the Trump side of the line or the ledger, or at least the anti-Biden Democratic side of the line of the ledger, or those who simply want a clean election, the Republican gubernatorial pickups that will be also with Republican legislatures in the states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania, and I think at least two of the three, if not all three, is very consequential indeed. But what do you guys think of Brazil?
What do we think of Brazil? We haven't discussed Brazil, and in fact, that's a good question. But I still think it'll be Lula. But it's a very good question because we have a contact in Brazil who's a very, very good journalist, and we should try and catch up with her and get her take of what's going on because I did a very good program on her show. And I think she owes us one in return, if I can say that. I still think it's going to be Lula. I think the institutional machinery is very much working in Lula's favor now. It's extraordinary because, of course, Lula was once upon a time, long ago, in a universe or a galaxy far away, he was the insurgent candidate. But today, it seems to me, he is the actual establishment candidate against Bolsonaro, who represents a kind of populist insurgency in Brazil. But I still think overall the weight of the institutions and the sort of working class support base that Lula had, enough of that is left, I think, to get him over the finishing line. And he's got the support of, the usual metro liberal types in the big cities who obviously don't like Bolsonaro for all the very obvious reasons that we all know. So I think it will be Lula, but I am not a betting man. And even if I was, I would be I would possibly hedge. I don't know. I'm not absolutely sure it will be Lula, but I think on balance it will be. Alex, what are your thoughts?
No, I said Lula, I think, is going to win. But two final questions, and we'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
One question is, was BlackRock up to something with the Bank of England? Were they doing something?
I haven't heard.
BlackRock's got fingers in every pie that exists.
Every pie, yeah.
Yes, you can almost always
yes,
find
they were.
a BlackRock trail.
Okay, yes, they were. And the final question before we wrap it up, Robert, all of these America First, let's call them that, Republicans who are positioned to win in the midterms, are they going to make a difference, specifically with what's going on, say, foreign policy-wise, domestic policy as well? Because the stories about what's going on with the Amish farmer, to me, are becoming more and more common. Almost every day I'm hearing stories like this in one form or another. Will they make a difference, or will the McConnells and the Lindsey Grahams continue to exert control?
I think there'll be disparity in outcome between state and federal level. So at the state level, people like Carrie Lake in Arizona are the real deal. She's like the DeSantis of Arizona. So I think you'll see, and if Republicans take back the governorships where they already have the legislatures in those northern states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania especially, then you'll see a lot of reform that's been blocked by the Democratic governors. Pass on elections, pass on emergency powers, pass on restricting future lockdowns and vaccine mandates, even passing laws that restrict and prohibit those in the future, expanding local state rights for farmers as to food supply, issues of medicine. So I think you'll see some really positive programmatic reforms. They might not all try to ship illegals over to Martha's Vineyard to have some kicks and giggles at the expense of liberals like DeSantis did, and then get the privilege of being sued by a Soros front group on a crazy claim. But you'll see some probably pretty sharp and smart laboratories of democracy on the populist right come from those state elections. The federal level, it will be more noise than consequence. The question is how much noise, and the noise will depend on Blake Masters and J.D. Vance. They win, there's noise out of the Senate because all of a sudden Rand Paul is not by himself raising questions senators don't want to vote on, like old Huey Long. He was down in the bottom of the rotunda, and he said, I got to decide when the mob comes. Do I stay in here and hang with you guys, or do I go outside and come in and hang the rest of you? So, they don't like those kind of voices hanging out in the Senate halls. And then on the House side, Kevin McCarthy, the reason why he does not want more than 240 House seats is because then he loses control of the caucus. He wants a narrow majority. He wants 225, 226. That's why he's made peculiar decisions in primaries and other places. It came out that he was behind the sabotage of Madison Cawthorn's campaign in North Carolina, strong populist critic of him. So, but the efforts to take out Gosar failed. The efforts to take out MTG failed. The efforts to take out other populists have failed. The effort last cycle to take out Thomas Massey failed. So Massey's very good on farm issues. So the key is you need populists to get elected, and you need enough for them to matter to where the margin is not so small that McCarthy can run a tight ship by saying, I got to get along with these moderate establishment types because they're the key between majority and no majority. So if they break 240, then populists will have a much louder voice. Where it will show up is it's almost a guarantee if they get over 240 House seats, Biden will be indicted before June. And they will go in. They will probably, I wish they would go into the Ukraine issues. I wish they would go into the pipeline sabotage issues. I wish they would go into these foreign policy disasters and debacles. They're more likely to focus on Biden's internal scandals and the political weaponization of the Justice Department. Those are still good issues to explore. But if it gets over 240, there will be exploration into those domestic scandals with deep state policies and priorities having gone AWOL and in the institutional sense. And so we'll see some populist progress, but there won't be meaningful populist progress at a federal level and a global international foreign policy until and unless someone like Trump wins in 2024 and there's a bigger populist majority in the House and the Senate coming in.
Right. Interesting. Right.
Wow. Fantastic.
Fantastic program, Robert. As always.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Another great program. Where can people find you, Robert?
All content, including hush hush videos, including a recent one on MK Ultra, a new one coming up on Mr. William Barr, and what his daddy might have been up to during World War II, and some little books he might have written as disguised fiction about what took place. Will be forthcoming, and all the other curated content, a Barnes Brief Daily that has lots of links and stories and articles, all types of great content created by our community, over 500 posts a day. And that is Viva BarnesLaw.locals.com. It's right up there, a little bit second to the Duran.locals.com in terms of great content.
Thank you very much.
You're very kind, Robert.
Let's thank everyone on Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, and the Duran.locals.com. I will have a link to Robert's Locals page in the description box and as a pinned comment. So definitely sign up to that. Join that board. It is the best. And thank you to our moderators, Valies, Zarael, let's see, Alice in Blunderland, Reckless Abandon, and who else? There was a name change. One of our moderators changed their handle, and I've lost track now. So I apologize for that. But we will get to all the questions in a separate program as well that me and Alexander will do, whatever questions we didn't answer. And let's sign out. We'll call it an evening. That's it.
That's Kamala. Well, Kamala Harris. I was saying Kamala Harris would say, we're working well with the North Koreans.
That's right.
That's right.
So funny.
What did Karine Jean-Pierre say? What did she say about Biden? Out of time or top of mind? Top of mind, everybody. Top of mind. All right. Take care.